Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to finish up looking at the index for the Adeptus Mechanicus. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 of this video, I suggest you check those out and I'll leave a link in the description down below. Anyway, with that being said, let's continue on where we left off in part 2. The first unit we're going to look at today is the Skitarii Marshal, and the Skitarii Marshal has definitely changed since his 9th edition incarnation. He has a reasonable stat line with a 6-inch movement speed, a 4+ normal save, and a 5+ invulnerable save, though he does have a low toughness of 3 and only 3 wounds. This does make him rather vulnerable, so on that end he's a little bit weak, and I wish he was a little bit more stronger, but let's see what he can do in terms of special abilities and items. For ranged weapons, he does only have a pistol weapon that does have devastating wounds at a 12-inch range with 1 attack, a 3+ ballistic skill, a strength of 6, and 1 armor penetration, as well as only 1 damage. This is actually a pretty decent weapon, though being a pistol weapon and only having 1 shot doesn't make it particularly impressive, though his melee weapon is a lot more interesting. The control stave gives him 4 attacks at a weapon skill of 3, a strength of 6, 1 armor penetration, and 1 damage. Definitely a perfectly fine melee profile, but there is a little bit of an issue, that being that he can only lead Skitarii Vanguard and Skitarii Ranger units, so he can't lead any of the more interesting units, and that does really limit his ability to kind of be a functional unit. Not only that, but he is a total of 45 points, which does make him a little bit pricey unless you really want to buff that unit of Skitarii. He does have the Doctrina Imperatives, and he has a handful of different special abilities. The first of those special abilities is the Control Edict, and the Control Edict says that while this model is leading a unit, each time a model in that unit makes an attack, you can reroll the hit roll. That's actually not a bad ability, and I think it's going to be pretty good with the Skitarii units, considering how the war gear shapes up within the 10th edition rules. So that's something definitely in his favor, and does make some of his points value a little bit more reasonable. The next ability he has is the Servo-Skull Uplink. This ability says that once per turn, you can select this model's unit for a stratagem, even if that stratagem has already been used on another unit from your army in this phase. This can be rather useful, allowing you to double up on some of your stratagems within the army, and considering that you can get data tethers and things like that to refund some command points, you can definitely get some mileage out of this ability that you might otherwise not be able to get in certain other armies. For the final special ability, it comes from a piece of war gear that he carries. This piece of war gear being the Control Stave. The Control Stave says that the bearer's unit can still be selected as the target of a stratagem even while they're battle shocked. That's pretty decent as well, though once again, it really does come down to how much you want to spend those 45 points, and how much you want to attach him to use these special abilities on a unit of Skitarii Rangers or Skitarii Vanguard. I do think there are some situations where you'll want to take him and use him with one of those units. However, that being said, I do think the Rangers and Vanguard are a little bit on the weaker side, and usually are going to be used as more of a support unit thanks to their battle line ability. This means that in a lot of cases, I think the Skitarii Marshal might be sitting on the sideline of different army builds, as he might just not be doing enough, considering that the unit he can lead is going to be a little bit on the weaker side, and I really wish he could have led some other types of units. Though that being said, I'm guessing that's more of a thematic choice than a power choice at the end of the day, so it is what it is, and I guess we have to make do with what we have in terms of this unit. I still think there are some situations where he's going to be pretty good, but I do think his power has been reduced from where it was within the 9th edition rules, and in terms of raw stats, without any upgrades, he's definitely a little bit of a lackluster unit, in my opinion, at the very least. Moving on, we come to the Skitarii Rangers, and by extension, the Skitarii Vanguard, as they're very similar units, being built out of the same kit, and for the most part have very similar stats, outside of a couple special abilities, so I'm just going to cover both of them at the same time, essentially. They both come in with pretty much a standard profile, with a 6-inch movement, a toughness of 3, a 5+ normal save, which has been nerfed from their 9th edition 4+ armor save, and they have a 6+ invulnerable save. And that's a little bit rough, though they do benefit from Doctrina's Imperatives, which can give them a little bit more durability, but that's a little bit of a rough situation to be in. And in terms of price for a unit, you can no longer take any variable size of these, so you can't take a unit of 5, you only have the option to take a unit of 10, and a unit of 10 Rangers will run you 125 points, while a unit of 10 Vanguard will run you 100 points. This makes me feel like the Vanguard might be a little better, as you get the special weapons on all of your units for free, and it really comes down to that distinction of their special abilities. So let's take a quick look at their different weapons, and get an idea of what they do. There are 3 special weapons, and you can have one of each special weapon in a unit of 10. The first is an arc rifle, which has an anti-vehicle profile of 4+, the devastating wounds ability, and the rapid fire ability of 1. This weapon has a 30-inch range, with 1 shot at a 4+ ballistic skill, a strength of 8, 1 armor penetration, and D3 damage. Not the worst thing in the world, and it's definitely a nice weapon to have. The Plasma Caliber has 2 different profiles, one being standard, one being supercharged. Both of them have a 30-inch range, 2 shots at a 4+ ballistic skill, and the regular profile has a strength of 7, 2 armor penetration, and 1 damage, with the overcharged profile gaining 1 point of strength, armor penetration, and damage, making it a lot stronger, though it does get the hazardous ability, which was previously known as overheating, meaning sometimes when you use it, you'll take out your own unit. So it is something you have to consider in terms of how you want to use it, as the standard profile will be enough in a lot of situations. Finally, there's a Transuranic Arquebus, which is a rather interesting weapon and comes on its own special base, having the heavy ability as well as the precision shots. It does have a longer range at 36 inches with 1 shot at a 4+ ballistic skill, 7 strength, 2 armor penetration, and D3 damage. I do think the one nice thing about these weapons in the 10th edition rule set is even though they all have their own unique little ability, they are pretty much similar in terms of profile, that you pretty much shoot them all at the same unit and feel decently enough okay in terms of what you're shooting. There are going to be situations where you want to make use of one of the special abilities over a different special ability, so it can be a little awkward at times, but I think those situations are going to be a little bit more rare. That being said, I am a little upset that you have to take one of each, and if you don't take them, you're essentially leaving points on the table as they're pretty much baked into your squad sizes. This means that each of your squads is going to look a little weird, and especially with the Vanguard, having that random Arquebus model can be definitely a little strange in terms of aesthetics, and it does make it a little bit more of an ugly unit and kind of hurts the lore and flavor of that unit in that sense, so that is a little bit of an unfortunate casualty in the new simplified rules. All in all, I'll say one thing, I'm really upset that you can't take units of 5 with 1 special weapon, and you're pretty much forced into this very narrow playstyle with the new Skitarii Rangers and Vanguard. However, let's continue looking at the Rangers in specific in terms of their special abilities and in terms of their basic weapons. Now, the Rangers come with a galvanic rifle that has been definitely reduced in power in the 10th edition rules. It now no longer has rapid fire or the heavy ability, and has a 30-inch range with 2 shots per ranger with a 4+ ballistic skill, a strength of 4, 0 armor penetration, and 1 damage per shot. This is definitely a pretty big reduction in terms of where it was within the 9th edition rules, where it had a strength of 5 and I believe 1 armor penetration. And that definitely makes the Rangers a lot weaker than they once were, and they no longer benefit from the improved invulnerable save for being veterans, so they are definitely a lot more fragile. They do come with a couple special abilities that they didn't have within the 9th edition rules in their base stat lines. That being one of their core abilities, which is a scout movement of 6 inches, which can be rather nice in getting them into position, considering sometimes you'll want a battle line unit to support a unit that's a little bit faster, so getting them into position a little bit beforehand can give you some ability to maneuver a little bit more efficiently, though that being said, they're still going to fall behind rather quickly due to their somewhat slow movement speed. As for the second ability, this one is called Objective Scouted. An Objective Scouted says, at the end of your command phase, if this unit is within range of an objective marker you control, that objective marker remains under your control, even if you have no models within range of it, until your opponent controls it at the start or end of any turn. Essentially, this says that if you put a unit of Rangers on an objective and move it on, you continue retaining the control of that objective. This can be rather nice and allows you to have some stickiness on your objectives, though at the end of the day, I think if you're going to hold an objective, you're probably going to keep models on it, so mostly this is going to come into play if a unit is wiped out and then you retain control of that objective before your opponent can get on top of that objective. That can be rather nice, and that definitely gives some power to the Rangers. That might be unique and might give you some motivation to run them in place of the Vanguard, though at the end of the day it kind of comes down to how much you need that kind of ability. They do also have the option to take the Enhanced Data Tether or the Omnispecs, and I think in a lot of situations you're going to be taking on Omnispecs in most cases. Now let's look at the Vanguard in terms of what they get for special abilities and base weapons. The Radium Carbine has an anti-infantry of 4+, which is nice but a little weaker than it was within the 9th edition rules, where it pretty much wounded anything on a 4+, and not just infantry in specific. It still has an 18-inch range, with 3 shots at a 4+ ballistic skill, with 3 strength, no armor penetration, and 1 damage per shot, so it does pretty much retain most of its 9th edition abilities, though it is a tiny bit weaker than it was within 9th edition. Let's take a look at the one special ability that the Vanguard have, as they don't have a special core ability, rather they just have the Doctrine Imperatives and the Rad Saturation Aura. The Rad Saturation Aura says, while an enemy unit, excluding vehicle units, is within 3 inches of this unit, subtract 1 from the objective control characteristic of models in that unit. Now that actually feels pretty powerful and can really allow you to take objectives in many cases. I do think in most situations you're probably going to be relying on the Vanguard over the Rangers, as you're probably going to want them to accompany units of Cataphrons and potentially a couple other units so that you can benefit from the battle line ability, and being able to take over contested objectives is a little bit better than sticky objectives in my opinion, but I can be proven wrong. However, where the big difference comes in is a unit of 10 Vanguard is only 100 points, so it really does add up if you're taking several units of these guys. And as such, I think the Vanguard are going to be a little more prevalent, though I wouldn't be surprised if you saw units both of Vanguard and Rangers within different army lists in the 10th edition rules. Though that being said, I will be leaning a little bit more on the Vanguard than I will be on the Rangers, just because I want them to be accompanying those Cataphrons more than I want them to be accompanying other units. And now I should take a little break to mention the sponsor of this video, that being VentureTradeCo.com, which sells different Warhammer 40k kits as well as Age of Sigmar kits at a 15% discount, as well as carrying some kits that might be a little bit harder to find, like some of the boarding patrol boxes that are still available on that site, as well as some of the kill team boxes such as Gallifall. They also carry a wide array of different collectibles, as well as things like comic books and hobby supplies. So do check them out if you're in the United States, and if you buy something from them, you do help the channel out, so it's win-win for both of us, as you get something you want at a bit of a discount, and you help support the channel at the same time, meaning that we both win in this transaction, so it's definitely mutually beneficial. Anyway, with that being said, let's return to our regularly scheduled content, and continue looking at the different Adeptus Mechanicus units. And now we come to the Scorpius Disintegrator tanks, and let's see if they've gotten a little bit of an improvement from 9th edition, or if they're still a little bit on the weaker side. And looking at the points cost, each Scorpius Disintegrator will come in at 195 points, which is a little bit expensive, especially considering what you get with the Dune Crawler. In terms of the stat profile, the Disintegrator has a 10-inch movement speed, a toughness of 10, and a 2+ regular save, with 12 wounds. It does not have an invulnerable save, which is a pretty big deal, and as such, I think it's going to fall behind the Dune Crawler in a lot of situations. In terms of weapons, the Disintegrator comes with 3 Cognis Heavy Stubbers, which have a pretty decent bolter profile and give it 9 shots without considering the rapid fire or the sustained hits. Now, in addition to that, you get the Disruptor Missile Launcher, which is a twin-linked weapon that has a 36-inch range, 3 shots at a 4+ ballistic skill, a strength of 9, 2 armor penetration, and d6 damage. That's actually not bad, and it does have an increased number of shots than it did within 9th edition. And seeing something like that, maybe the Disintegrator is a little bit better than I first thought it would be at that increased points value. And then it has 2 different options in terms of what weapon you can choose for its turret, and each of them are a bit different from one another. The first is the Belleros Energy Cannon, which has the blast profile as well as indirect fire, and a 36-inch range with 2d6 attacks, meaning that on average you'll be getting roughly 7 shots with it, with a 4+ ballistic skill, a strength of 7, 2 armor penetration, and 1 damage. That's definitely significantly improved from its 9th edition incarnation of this weapon, though do keep in mind you still get detriments for using that indirect fire profile. However, some of the special abilities might counteract some of those penalties. As for the Pharamite Cannon, it has a 48-inch range with 3 shots at a 4+ ballistic skill with a strength of 12, 3 armor penetration, and d6 damage. As far as the Pharamite Cannon goes, I still think you're probably going to be better off with either a Dune Crawler or some number of Ballistari, but all things being considered, the combination of that improved Disruptor Missile Launcher and the Pharamite Cannon might have some potential as well. However, I still think if you're going to be fielding this unit, you're going to go with the Belleros Energy Cannon instead of the Pharamite Cannon, once again within 10th edition. So let's look at the special abilities that the Disintegrator has. The Disintegrator has the Doctrine of Imperatives, which is a rather nice ability to have, as you can gain some additional accuracy through that heavy profile and some additional potential armor penetration. Now, it does have the broad spectrum data tether, which can help you recoup some command points. However, it has one unique special ability, that being the Blistering Salvos special ability. The Blistering Salvo says each time this model makes an attack with the Belleros Energy Cannon that targets an infantry unit, add 1 to the hit roll. This is pretty good and does counteract some of those penalties for using indirect fire. This can definitely make it a lot more of an anti-infantry ability that can let you take out some enemy units on an objective that are concealed from your vision. So this definitely does make the Belleros Energy Cannon a lot better than it was by the end of the 9th edition rule set. There is a second part to the Blistering Salvos ability, however it benefits the Pharamite Cannon and says each time this model makes an attack with the Pharamite Cannon that targets a monster or vehicle unit, add 1 to the hit roll. So it definitely shows that both these weapons have a bit of a bonus when targeting specific types of units, and I do think it's a nice little ability that makes you kind of consider on how you use this weapon, as opposed to just kind of being a generic ability that affects all different models at the same time. So that being said, at 195 points, I do think the Scorpius Disintegrator is still a little bit pricey. However, I do think there is some justification for taking one of these with that Belleros Energy Cannon, just to give yourself access to that indirect fire, so you can take out some units maybe holding an objective that are hidden behind terrain. Not only that, but the 3 Disruptor Missile Launcher shots, in addition to the on average 7 shots you'll be getting from that Belleros Energy Cannon with their respective profiles, can still do a decent amount of damage even when not using that indirect fire to a variety of different targets, and that gives the Disintegrator a lot more potential. However, the price point is still a bit high, and the Scorpius Disintegrator can be a little bit fragile, considering it only has a 2+ normal save and no invulnerable save like the Dune Crawler. So I guess what it really comes down to is how many Dune Crawlers and how many Ballistari you have, in addition to some of the other units, and if you're really looking for that kind of offensive profile, in addition to the indirect fire, which can be very powerful. So that's quite a lot of different things to keep in mind, and I still think the Scorpius Disintegrator is probably going to be sitting on the sideline once again, but I do think there is a lot of potential for having one of these within your army list, or at least having access to one of these when building an army list, as it can give you access to some flexible weapons that you might otherwise not have within your army. Moving on, we come to the other Scorpius tank, being the Scorpius Dune Rider. This one is a transport as opposed to a gun platform, and let's see how it does within the 10th edition rules, as it kind of fell off the face of the earth within the end of 9th edition due to unit sizes and the general points increase in its cost. In 10th edition, it seems to have seen a bit of a points reduction, only being 80 points per model, and that definitely bodes well for the Scorpius Dune Rider. In terms of a profile, it has a 12-inch movement speed, a toughness of 9, a 3+ normal save, and no invulnerable save, with 11 wounds total, and it does benefit from Doctrina Imperatives. And that's pretty decent considering it's just a low-cost transport tank, and it can transport a total of 12 Adeptus Mechanicus infantry, with the exception of jump pack or Cataphrone models. In addition to that, it comes armed with one weapon, being a Cognus Heavy Stubber Array. The Cognus Heavy Stubber Array is essentially equivalent to 3 Cognus Heavy Stubbers, having a 36-inch range, 9 attacks total, with a 4+ ballistic skill, 4 strength, 0 armor penetration, and 1 damage. It has rapid fire 9 and sustained hits 1. So all in all, they could have just replaced this with 3 Cognus Heavy Stubbers and achieved the same results, but in either case, that's a bit of a nitpick, and it's a perfectly fine amount of armament for a transport unit. In addition to that, it does have a broad spectrum data tether, and one special ability known as Dune Rider. Dune Rider says units can disembark from this transport after it has advanced. Units that do so count as having made a normal move that phase, and cannot declare a charge in the same turn, but otherwise act normally in the remainder of that turn. That's a pretty decent ability, and does allow it to be a little bit more of a functional transport, so I definitely think it can have some potential within 10th edition rules, considering all of your squad sizes are now limited to 10 units, so you do have a lot more options in terms of what you can transport, without necessarily having to make your army weaker by reducing your squad sizes, when you would have wanted 15 or 20 models within a squad of Skitarii Rangers or Skitarii Vanguard. All in all, I think you might see a few more Dune Riders within 10th edition if people are going to be looking for transports for their Adeptus Mechanicus armies, although at the same time I think armies are going to be focusing a little bit more heavily on things like the different Iron Strider models, the Cataphrons, and so forth. So I do think there's going to be a little bit less of a need for transport units such as the Dune Rider, but there might be some situations where you'll want it anyway, and you might break away from that kind of more mechanical monster style of army that the AdMechs seem to be trending towards within the new edition. So it pretty much comes down to how you're building a list, if you want this unit or not, but in the situation you want to transport, it's definitely a perfectly fine option. Moving on, we come to the Sidonian Dragoons, who have seen a decent amount of changes within the 10th edition rules. The Sidonian Dragoons can be taken in units of 1, 2, or 3 models, similar to the Ballistari units. Each Dragoon will cost you a total of 75 points, and gives you the following stat profile. The Dragoons have a 10-inch movement speed, a toughness of 7, a 3+ normal save, and a 5+ invulnerable save. They also have 7 wounds each, and have the stealth ability as well as Doctrina Imperatives. This actually makes them a lot more resilient than you might consider at first glance, and they can be actually rather powerful. They also have elevated Strider ability, which means they can fall back and shoot and charge within the same turn, as well as the broad spectrum data tether, which allows you to recoup command points. They do have Deadly Demise 1, but considering this is a melee unit, that sometimes will go to your benefit, as opposed to your detriment when they do start exploding. In terms of weapons, they still have similar options to their 9th edition version, but they have been changed in certain ways. The first thing to consider is that the Phosphorus Serpenta is free now, and it's a decent enough weapon. It ignores cover, has an 18-inch range, 1 attack at a 4+ ballistic skill, with a strength of 5, 1 armor penetration, and 2 damage. That's actually pretty decent for a weapon you get completely for free, and pretty much always take on all of your Sidonian Dragoons, so that's definitely something in their favor. And continuing on looking at their weapons, the Radium Giselle has definitely seen an improvement, now having a 3+ anti-infantry ability, and the heavy profile and precision shots, as well as a 36-inch range, with 1 attack, a 4+ ballistic skill, 5 strength, 2 armor penetration, and 3 damage per shot. I don't think the Radium Giselle is good enough to be played within the 10th edition rules, as 1 shot is definitely kind of lackluster considering that you're paying 75 points per model, and this is definitely one of those items that would have heavily benefited from differences in points cost when it comes to war gear, as maybe at 50 points you might have considered grabbing a Radium Giselle with a Phosphorus Serpenta as just an additional backup unit, but as it stands now, I don't think you'll ever be choosing the Radium Giselle over the Taser Lance. So what does the Taser Lance do? The Taser Lance has quite a few different abilities, having an anti-walker profile of 2+, the Lance ability which says if this unit has charged, it gets +1 to its wound roll, and then it has sustained hits too, which means it scores 2 additional hits if you roll an unmodified 6, similar to how the Taser Lance behaved in 9th edition. Where it seems to have gone better is that now it has 4 attacks at a weapon skill of 4+, which is a little bit weaker, as I believe it had a 3+ weapon skill in 9th edition. It has a strength profile of 7, 2 armor penetration, and 2 damage. I definitely think with the 4 attacks, considering the profile, there's definitely some merit to running a unit of Sidonian Dragoons within the 10th edition rules, and I think I might prefer the Sidonian Dragoons over the Ballistari for the 10th edition rule set as it stands now. That being said, I think both are perfectly fine, and I think you can run both within a list, though if I had to pick one or the other, I think the Sidonian Dragoons would be my go-to, as it can kind of advance them up the board and get them into combat and start doing quite a decent amount of damage, as a unit of 3 of them will be putting out 12 attacks at that reasonably decent profile, especially on the charge where they benefit from the Lance ability. And not only that, but you can definitely have a lot more melee options for the Adeptus Mechanicus forces within the 10th edition rule set as it seems now, as those Ruststalkers are rather good, the Breachers are rather powerful as well, and now the Sidonian Dragoons as well as Castellans can make up the rest of your army, thus giving you a lot more potential to be a much more aggressive Adeptus Mechanicus force. And do remember that if your opponent stays within their deployment zone, they're going to be suffering from that Rad Bombardment initial ability that the Adeptus Mechanicus have. Anyway, with that being said, I think that pretty much sums up the Sidonian Dragoons rather well. Now, the next unit we're going to look at is the Tech Priest Dominus. The Tech Priest Dominus comes in at a whopping 75 points per model, which isn't too bad, all things considered. He has a 6-inch movement speed, a toughness of 4, a 2+ normal save, and a 5+ invulnerable save. He also comes with 4 wounds, and can lead Skitarii, Cataphrons, as well as Electro Priests. His weapon choices are still pretty similar to what they were with the 9th edition, though I do think the Eradication Ray is something you'll probably take alongside the Phosphor Serpenta, as I think they're just a little bit better than the other 2 choices. However, there could be some arguments made for both the Volkite Blaster and the Macro Stubber in situations where you want to take those, as there might be situations where you want to take those, though personally I think it may be running the Eradication Ray as it hits reasonably hard, and the Phosphor Serpenta isn't bad either. The Omniscient Axe is still pretty much what it was before, however what really makes the Tech Priest Dominus something that I want to include within my list is his special ability known as Lord of the Machine Cult. Lord of the Machine Cult says that while this model is leading a unit, models in that unit have a Feel No Pain save of 5+. If the unit he's leading is a unit of Electro Priests, their Feel No Pain save goes up to a 4+ instead. So that's pretty good in both situations, and I think if you put a Dominus with a unit of Cataphron Breachers, you can definitely make them rather tanky with their increased toughness profile, as well as their normal save and invulnerable save coupled with that Feel No Pain, making them a rather scary unit for your opponent to deal with. And there's even potentially some debate to be had if including him in a unit of Electro Priests makes sense, considering that he does have a decent enough melee profile with Omniscient Axe, and having a 4+ Feel No Pain save can go a rather long way in a unit of something like the Fulgurites, where you can potentially put them in a Dune Crawler, get them next to an opponent, and charge in and wreak absolute havoc in melee with that unit. That being said, that does go up in points really heavily for a single unit, and at the end of the day, I think I'd just rather put him with a unit of Cataphrons and have fun in that situation. He does have one other special ability, being the Data Spike ability, which says at the start of the fight phase, you can select one enemy vehicle unit within engagement range of this model's unit, and roll 1d6. On a 4+, that enemy unit suffers d6 mortal wounds, and until the end of the phase, the weapon skill characteristic of melee weapons equipped by that enemy unit is worsened by 1, and while that doesn't seem like a particularly impressive ability, it can be rather nice if you ever happen to engage something like an enemy unit of Castellans or similar units that want to be within melee and happen to have the vehicle keyword. That way basically your Cataphrons can make short work of them, and the Tech Priest Dominus can definitely contribute by making it that much harder for your opponent to swing back at you. Essentially he becomes a rather big threat in that situation. I don't think you're really going to be running up to tanks and using this ability on enemy tanks, but there might be some situations where you do end up with a tank in melee combat for whatever reason, and in that situation it's perfectly fine as well. In any case, I do think the Dominus is something that I will include in a lot of my lists to lead at least one unit, just to get that really nice Feel No Pain save on something like a large unit of Cataphron Breachers. And now we come to the next unit, which is the Tech Priest Engine Seer. The Tech Priest Engine Seer costs only a total of 45 points, making him a rather cheap choice. He has a 6-inch movement, a toughness of 4, a 3+ normal save, 3 wounds, and a 5+ invulnerable save. He does not benefit from Doctrina Imperatives, but it doesn't look like any of the Tech Priests do. He has his Archaeotech pistol, which isn't a bad profile, but once again it's a pistol, so who really cares? He does come with an Omniscient Axe, which gives him 3 attacks at a 4+ weapon skill, 6 strength, 2 armor penetration, and 2 damage. That's definitely not a bad profile, and he gets an extra attack with his Servo Arm, which has 1 attack at the same profile as the Omniscience Axe and can be essentially treated as the same thing, just as a bonus attack. He does have a few different special abilities, the first one being the Engine Seer ability that says while this model is within 3 inches of one or more friendly Adeptus Mechanicus vehicles, unless the Engine Seer is leading a unit, this model has the Lone Operative ability. Not the worst thing, but I definitely think he's going to be leading a unit in most situations. He also has the Omnissiah's Blessing, which says in your command phase, select one friendly Adeptus Mechanicus model. Within 3 inches of this model, that model regains up to D3 lost wounds, and if it is a vehicle model until the start of your next command phase, that model has a 4+ invulnerable save, and each model can only be selected for this ability once per command phase. That can actually be a rather powerful ability as well, as you can give something like the Scorpius Disintegrator a 4+ invulnerable save that it otherwise lacks, or you can buff other vehicles within your army. Do keep in mind that this targets a model and does not target a unit, so it does have to be specified on which model you're using it on. However, the nice thing is you can target non-vehicle models with this ability, so if you put him as a leader of a unit of Cataphrons, that can be rather good in itself, as he can kind of heal up one of those Cataphron breachers every single turn if they happen to survive. And one other thing that someone points out in the comment section of the previous video is you can basically put a unit of Servitors with the Engine Seer and then group them with a unit of Cataphrons, and essentially when attacks come in, if they're rather high-powered attacks, you can allocate them to Servitors, thus giving your Cataphrons a little bit more of a buffer. That definitely makes the Engine Seer a lot more interesting than I initially thought when you can consider using him in that situation. And it also makes the Servitors a little bit more interesting and really does give you kind of an alternative to what the Dominus does in that Feel No Pain save. That being said, I think the Dominus is something I would prefer before the Tech Priest Engine Seer. However, if I'm running 2 units of Cataphrons, I would definitely consider to some extent running a Dominus and an Engine Seer for that specific reason. That being said, there's one more special ability that the Engine Seer has and I think is actually very interesting, that being the Vengeance for the Omnissiah. This ability says that if a friendly Adeptus Mechanicus vehicle model is destroyed within 12 inches of this model until the end of the battle, this model's Omniscience Axe has an attack characteristic of 6. That actually makes him a pretty scary melee character, as all of a sudden he has 7 attacks, with that strength of 6, 2 armor penetration, and 2 damage, when considering his Omniscient Axe and the Servo Arm. He also still has that pistol, which can come into play as well. So that being said, I do think there's some interesting ability to use him with a unit of Cataphrons, and having them within a pretty close range of something like a unit of Castellans or Sidonian Dragoons, so that when one of those dies, as keep in mind it's a model and not a unit that has to be destroyed, all of a sudden the Tech Priest Engine Seer kind of goes into a berserk mode, and all of a sudden starts hitting really hard within melee, and when combined with those regular Servitors and Cataphrons, he can actually be rather scary and provide a lot of utility to your units, as well as providing them with some additional durability and offensive capabilities. Not to mention that the Omnissiah's Blessing can be rather powerful as well. And with that in mind, costing only 45 points, I do think the Engine Seer is very interesting within 10th edition, and I really applaud them for making him kind of an interesting model that you might want to consider, whereas within 9th edition and even 8th edition, he was just kind of this filler unit that sometimes took a holy order, and for the most part wasn't particularly played for his own merits, even though he was included with the Comp Patrol box and one of the Start Collecting boxes. As such, I do think the Engine Seer is very interesting within 10th edition, and I'm definitely excited to try him out within an army list at least a couple times, so I definitely applaud Games Workshop for making the Engine Seer more interesting. The next model we come to is the Typewase Manipulus, who now comes in at a total of 60 points and I think has been a little bit nerfed within 10th edition. He has a profile that gives him a 6-inch movement speed, a toughness of 4, a 2+ regular save, and a 5+ invulnerable save with 4 wounds total. He still has his Magna Rail Lance and Transonic Cannon. Both are decent enough weapons, but it looks like the Transonic Cannon has definitely been nerfed from its 9th edition version. So most likely I'll be taking the Magna Rail Lance and hoping that one shot can do some damage to the enemy units. He also no longer has any Mechadendrites, rather he has the Omniscient Staff and nothing else in terms of melee weapons. It does seem like the Mechadendrites have been removed from most profiles, as neither the Dominus nor the Manipulus has them anymore within 10th edition, and it looks like only Belisarius Call has retained his Mechadendrites. That's a little bit sad, as both these Tech Priests do have the Mechadendrites modeled on their model, so it does feel like a little bit of a bummer that they no longer have access to that ability. Anyway, let's take a look at the special abilities that the Manipulus has and see if they make sense for his points cost. He has 2 different special abilities, the first one being Galvanic Field. Galvanic Field says, while this model is leading a unit, weapons equipped by models in that unit have the Lethal Hits ability. And just as a quick reminder, what Lethal Weapons does is each time an attack is made with such a weapon, a critical hit automatically wounds the target. So it's not a bad ability to have, but remember, you have to be putting out quite a decent amount of shots to trigger that, as you essentially need to roll an unmodified 6 to hit. Though grouping him with something like a unit of Skitarii Vanguard can definitely give you a decent amount of shots, and the same goes for Corpuscari Electro Priests, just due to the volume of shots that a unit of 10 of them can put out. The little bit of annoying thing is now that you're taking those special weapons on a unit of Vanguard, it can become a little bit annoying grouping him there, so it makes it even harder to use the Manipulus to gain those lethal hits, as you're reducing the number of shots you're going to be getting total, making the effect of that ability even weaker. And you don't want to leave those special weapons behind because you'll be essentially wasting points as they're included within the profile, and that kind of shows the issue of some of the simplification of the 10th edition rule set. That being said, maybe grouping him with a unit of Corpuscari Electropriests could definitely be interesting, as you can put out a ton of shots and get a bunch of free wounds. Maybe that's where his best utilization is, or you can even just go with a basic unit of Skitarii Vanguard and just kind of eat the cost of those special weapons, as they do end up being a little bit cheaper for a unit of 10 than Corpuscari Electropriests. But once again, I think the Corpuscari are a better choice, especially if you put them in a Dune Rider, and then you just hope to kind of generate enough shots in order to make the lethal hits take out some targets before they can really strike back. However, I think that's all a little bit too cute. Now let's take a look at the second ability that the Manipulus has. The second ability is Defend the Divine Work, and this ability says, once per battle, at the start of any phase, this model can use this ability. If it does until the end of the phase, all models in this model's unit have a 4+ invulnerable save. That's a pretty interesting ability that can do a decent amount of work if used in the correct turn. I don't know where I would really want to in specific, though giving a 4+ invulnerable save to a unit of something like Vanguard or Cataphront Destroyers can definitely go a long way. Maybe that is how you end up using the Manipulus, is by grouping them with some Cataphront Destroyers, because they can put out a decent amount of shots with some of their weapons, and considering the Cataphront Destroyers are pretty inexpensive now, you can get a decent number of shots with them, and essentially get some free wounds, and then if your opponent shoots back at you, you can give them a 4+ invulnerable save to essentially keep them around for one additional turn, making a little bit of annoyance for your opponent. I don't really know how I feel about this unit, because at 60 points, it does feel a little bit too cute for what you're getting. However, at the same time, the 4+ invulnerable save is something that's kind of a little bit tempting, even if it's only for one turn, and the lethal hits get on up pretty quickly, especially on a unit with a lot of shots. Though at the same time, you are required to roll a 6 to hit, and do remember that with something like a Cognos Flamer, on those Cataphront Breachers, you don't actually roll to hit with something like the Cognos Flamer due to the Torrent ability, meaning that you can't actually use the Cognos Heavy Flamer to proc lethal hits, even though it has a decent number of attack. So in that situation, you'll probably be looking to maximize with some of those Plasmas, as well as the Phosphor Blaster, though that does seem to be getting a little bit too far into the weeds for what you'd be doing in other situations. And with the Corpuscari, you aren't getting as much of a benefit from that once a game 4+ invulnerable save. So that being said, I think the Manipulus is going to have a hard time finding a home, but he can come into play in certain situations if your army can really benefit from one of those special abilities. Though, like I said, I think it's going to be hard to find a home for him in a lot of the different lists that you're going to be building for the 10th edition rules. And now we come to a final unit, being the Technoarchologist. The Technoarchologist was added in 9th edition and was previously known as the Deolosis. This model has seen quite a few different changes throughout its lifespan within the Adeptus Mechanicus forces. This model will come in at 45 points, similar to the Engine Seer and Skitarii Marshal. The Technoarchologist has a 6-inch movement speed, a toughness of 4, a 3+ normal save, and a 5+ invulnerable save, with 3 wounds, giving him a pretty standard profile for a Tech Priest model. He does not have Doctrine Imperatives, being a Tech Priest in his own right. He comes with his Archaeotech Pistol and a Serval Claw, which aren't particularly bad weapons, and the Serval Claw is actually kind of scary at a strength of 8, 2 armor penetration, and 2 damage. It also has a Devastating Wounds ability, and an anti-vehicle profile of 4+. That being said, I'm not particularly going to be running him into any vehicles, however if he does happen to encounter one, or some enemy units, he can put out some decent amount of damage. He has a couple special abilities, and I do think these special abilities are kind of exciting. The first of those abilities is the Seeker of the Divine Arcana, which says that while this model is leading a unit, add 1 to the objective control characteristic of models in that unit. Generally speaking, objective control abilities are rather powerful within 40k, as 40k is a game about controlling and completing objectives. So that being said, we've seen a lot of units like the Dogmata for the Sisters of Battle, and other units similar to that, seeing a decent amount of play within their respective armies. As such, I definitely think the Technoarchologist can see some play, as that ability can be rather powerful no matter what unit you group him with, and he can lead units of Cataphrons, Electropriests, and Skitarii Rangers and Vanguard. However, that being said, there are quite a good amount of leaders within the Tech Priest choices, make him a little bit hard to fit into a list, but I can definitely see if you have 45 points to spend, he can definitely be a decent enough model to group within a unit in order to take objectives and kind of continue controlling them. He does have one other special ability that I think is also rather powerful, that being the Cogitative Instincts, which says that enemy units that are set up on the battlefield as reinforcements cannot be set up within 12 inches horizontally of this model. That also creates a zone of control, which makes it harder for your opponent to deep strike or set up units next to, giving you even more ability to control certain objectives. You can definitely screen certain units out from being able to effectively deep strike within the game, thanks to that additional bubble of influence, and that objective control is rather powerful. Also, considering he's only 45 points, he does seem like a rather powerful unit, and I do think that's one of those units that's probably going to see some experimentation within different army lists, but he might ultimately trend out of lists over time if they don't see a specific need for that objective control, if they have something like enough lethality to essentially keep your opponent from being able to effectively control objectives, or if the Adeptus Mechanicus armies aren't particularly interested in fighting over objectives in that specific sense. It would have been pretty cool to have him to join a unit of Castellans, as I think he would have been most interesting in that situation, but unfortunately he cannot lead any units of Castellans, and none of the other tech priests seem to be able to do that either, so that's a bit of a shame. In any case, I like the new Technoarchologist, and I think he's going to be fun to play around with. And with that being said, we've covered all the different units, so let's take a quick look at the few special abilities that you can take as detachment enhancements that are like holy orders, where you can buy them with points but act a little bit more like war gear in some situations. So there are a total of 4 different detachment enhancements you can take, and one thing I think that's interesting about the detachment enhancements is if you look at the top, it says if you are using the Rad Cohort detachment rule, you can use these Rad Cohort enhancements. That makes me think that in future releases, we're going to see additional detachment options in terms of how you can run your Adeptus Mechanicus forces, and different detachments may have different special abilities as well as different detachment enhancements you can buy. That's a little bit of speculation, but that would be really cool, and the wording here does make me think that might be the case. That being said, let's take a look at the enhancements themselves. The first one is the Archive Purge Protocols, which is only a total of 10 points. This can only be given to Skitarii Marshals, which does increase the value of that Skitarii Marshal that I wasn't too fond of to begin with. And this enhancement says that at the start of the battle round, you can select one friendly Skitarii unit within 12 inches of the bearer, and until the start of your next battle round, the opposite Doctrina is active than the one that is active for your army. For 10 points, this isn't a bad ability, though it's a little bit lackluster and still doesn't really make me want to take a Skitarii Marshal as much as I want to take other tech breach choices. Though this ability can come in handy, especially if you want a certain unit to be more offensive while the rest of your army is more defensive and vice versa. So there are definitely situations where you'll want to play this, and I can see this being kind of powerful in certain game states. So if you are taking a Skitarii Marshal, I think this is something you'll take in most situations considering the low points cost and considering that it can be rather effective. It really hinges on if you're taking that Skitarii Marshal to begin with, and I think I'm probably going to pass on it for now, but I could definitely be wrong on that one, so we'll have to see how it plays out. The next enhancement is the Excoriating Emanations. This enhancement says that it can be only given to an Adeptus Mechanicus model, and while the bearer is leading a unit, models in that unit have the stealth ability. This enhancement costs you a total of 25 points, and I definitely think it's pretty exciting, as once again I can take that Dominus, throw him in a unit of Cataphront Breachers to give them that Feel No Pain save, and now I can give them an additional stealth benefit, making them even more resilient, and all that kind of adds up pretty quickly to make them a rather impressive unit, but do keep in mind the points cost is quickly growing in all of those situations. Or inversely, you can throw it on that Engine Seer that's leading a unit of Servitors and Cataphrons and give yourself a little bit more resilience in that sense. In any case, I do think that the Excoriating Emanation is definitely something that is a very nice upgrade, and if you can spare the points for it, you definitely want to take it in order to give yourself that additional resilience. The third upgrade will cost you a total of 35 points, and that is Master Annihilator. Master Annihilator can only be given to an Adeptus Mechanicus model, and while the bearer of this enhancement is leading a unit, ranged weapons equipped by models in that unit have the Sustained 1 hits ability, and that's not bad as you can increase the number of hits you get within any shooting phase. But for 35 points, it is kind of pricey, and I think this is one of those things where I probably won't necessarily take it unless I just happen to have the points laying around. So for the most part, I don't think this makes the cut, but if you're building something like a Manipulus with a unit of Cataphront Destroyers, you might want to consider this, as it can definitely help you with some of your output. But do remember that in situations where you're scoring additional hits, they're not associated with any roll, so if you do score that additional hit, you will still have to roll to wound for it, as it will not benefit from the lethal hits ability, making it a little bit weaker. And finally, the last enhancement you can take will cost you a total of 20 points and is known as the Omni Sterilizer. This can only be taken by an Adeptus Mechanicus model, and it says add 3 to attacks characteristic of the bearer's ranged weapon. In addition, the bearer's ranged weapons have an anti-infantry of 2+, and an anti-monster profile of 4+. That's not bad, but at 20 points, I think this is just something you take on as a throw-in, and not something you would take before Excoriating Emanations, though there might be some situations where if I have a Dominus within my army, I might consider taking the Omni Sterilizer in order to improve his ranged weapons, as it can be definitely okay. Also do notice that there's something interesting about the wording here, and that says Adeptus Mechanicus model, and unless I'm missing something, it doesn't say anywhere that you have to put it on a character. So can you put this on something like Scorpius Disintegrator? If that's the case, this definitely becomes a little bit more interesting than if you're restricted to putting it on a specific character. Because all of a sudden, that adds quite a lot of additional shots to something like the Scorpius Disintegrator, or even on a Dragoon Crawler, and if you can actually give this enhancement to vehicles, that does make it a lot more interesting, as initially when I was reading it, I thought it would be Adeptus Mechanicus characters, but all it says is Adeptus Mechanicus models only. If you can give this to vehicles and other things that have really high power weapons, I definitely think this is a very, very powerful ability, because essentially when you're adding 3 shots to all of your ranged weapons, in some cases you're almost essentially getting an additional vehicle for a total cost of 20 points, not even considering those anti-infantry and anti-monster benefits, and you're almost getting a double Dune Crawler, or almost an additional Disintegrator in terms of benefits. So like I said, if this can be given to anything, the Omni Sterilizer is an incredibly powerful item, but if it can only be given to characters, then it's just kind of a little bit of a side upgrade. So it really comes down to that, but man, is that powerful if you can give that to any Adeptus Mechanicus vehicle. Definitely will have to look into that, and I'm definitely taking it on my Dune Crawler every single time if I can give it to a Dune Crawler. But if it's a character, it's just there to eat up a couple points that are left over at the end of the list creation, so it's a lot weaker. That pretty much covers the Adeptus Mechanicus, and in terms of first look, I do think the Adeptus Mechanicus look pretty okay, but they definitely build in a very different way than they did with a 9th edition and even 8th edition, which seems to always happen with a new edition when it comes to the Adeptus Mechanicus, and that's a bit of a shame because it does make it harder for players to buy and build armies for the Adeptus Mechanicus, as you're kind of constantly changing what you have to build within a list. That being said though, I do think the Adeptus Mechanicus are going to be rather good with things like the Cataphron Breachers, accompanied by characters, and then additional things like Honored Dragoon Crawlers, Bellastari, and Sidonian Dragoons are going to be kind of a mainstay of your army, and the Rangers and Vanguard are just going to be more of a support unit that you take in order to gain that battle line ability. So all in all, I think you're going to see a much more monster-style build for the Adeptus Mechanicus forces in the 10th edition rules if everything kind of goes the way I think it is. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if you have those models available to you, but if you build out a giant army of Rangers and Vanguard for the 9th edition rules, and now you're kind of forced to completely change how your army runs, it's going to be a little bit of a pain, and I do think some of the simplification definitely made it really awkward to build an army, as a lot of people probably didn't build all the special weapons, so now they had to kind of figure those out, and all of a sudden you're going to have very awkward looking units of your Vanguard running around with transuranic arquebuses. It's definitely very messy, but the parts of the Adeptus Mechanicus that are good, I think are going to be rather good, and I don't think they can be counted out as an army yet. However, I haven't really seen what other armies have in terms of their units. It really does come down to how good other armies are, because at the end of the day, no matter how good you are, if other armies are just significantly better than you, then you're not particularly that great, even if you're better than your previous edition incarnation. So that being said, in the next video, we'll take a look at the Adeptus Mechanicus Common Patrol rules, and see how those work, and then we'll probably start looking at other armies, as we did in the past, to see what their indexes are like, and to see how they compare to the Adeptus Mechanicus, because knowing what your opponent can do is just as important as knowing what you can do. So we'll have to see how things play out with other armies and how their indexes treated them. Anyway, as always, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the content, do like and subscribe for additional content in the future. If you didn't like the video, then dislike it if you dislike it. And as always, don't be afraid to share this video in places where you think people might benefit from the content. And as always, thank you for watching, have a great day, see you next time, bye.